when we were debating at Mariazell High School, and then when you came after your opponent, Sister Benedette would say, Muni vrakniam kenersne, Muni vrakniam, which means don't revenge or avenge yourself against your opponent. So I'm sure some of the commissioners here will want to do that.
Judge Mbuyiseli Madlanga, the first to appear before the JSC. We bring you what the Chief Justice hopeful had to say during that interview today. President Cyril Ramaphosa's office receives and releases the second part of the state capture inquiry report. We look at some of the key findings and recommendations, as well as the next steps that now need to be taken to bring the culprits to book. And
what we have been doing has been a continuation of work which we had started last year in the first quarter of the year, wherein we embarked on an inspection in loco in the various institutions of higher learning in the country.
Today she completes 2 years as the Deputy Public Protector. What does Advocate Galega have to show for her tenure? All that and more coming up in tonight's episode of The Watchdog, which starts now. We begin here. It's out, and the second part of the report of the Judicial Commission of Inquiry into allegations of state capture, corruption and fraud in the public sector is much bigger than the first, even though it only deals with parastatals Transnet and Denel. Transnet, the Commission says, was the primary site of state capture in financial terms. 72.2% of total state payments in respect of contracts tainted by state capture were done at Transnet. The report also says that the primary architects, enablers and implementers of state capture at Transnet were primarily former CEO Brian Molife, former CFO Anoj Singh, and former Transnet Freight Rail CEO Siyabonga Gama. Their appointments, the report says, were followed by the awarding of significant contracts to businesses the Gupta family owned or benefited handsomely from. Salim Essa, a Gupta henchman, set up front companies whose purpose was to facilitate, among other things, the payment of kickbacks. Lots of questions around former President Jacob Zuma, what he knew, didn't know, or what he professed to know or really didn't know. Take a listen to the Commission's Secretary, Professor Jerry Mosala, as he was officially and symbolically handing over part 2 of the state capture report to the Director General in the Presidency.
Today we are delivering part 2 of the report. It is envisaged that there will be 3 parts to the report altogether. We had hoped that we would have been able to include 2 more of the volumes inside, but as you can see, these things tend to be big. So part 3 will actually be very, very, very big when it comes.
On behalf of the President, Prof, we are highly appreciative of all the hard work that you've put in to get to this point, and we do realize that you do spend sleepless nights in service of the nation on such a big project that the whole country is interested in. So we really appreciate it. We hope that you feel properly rewarded when it's all done.
President Cyril Ramaphosa had, of course, said that he would act on the recommendations of the state capture report only after receiving all three parts. Now, the third and final part is set to be submitted by the end of this month. If I'm not mistaken, it's supposed to be February the 28th. But in a statement released today after the symbolic handout, you saw there President Ramaphosa said the commission, and I quote, has constructed a disturbing picture of the depth and damage of state capture. The president says we should now apply our energies to the commission's recommendations and take the necessary steps to make sure that we never face this onslaught on public resources and on the fabric of our society again. We're going to look into the recommendations and the next steps in a short while. That's coming up after this short break. Into allegations of state capture, corruption and fraud in the public sector is now out. It's been handed over to President Cyril Ramaphosa's office, and in it paints, of course, the report, maybe I should say or point out, only deals with parastatals, Transnet and Denel. And Transnet, the report says, was the primary site of state capture in financial terms. 72.2% of total state payments in respect of contracts that are tainted by state capture were done at Transnet. Let's bring into the conversation now Michael Merchant, who is the head of investigations at organization Open Secrets. Michael, good evening. Thanks very much for your time. Were you surprised when you read, or in the time you've been able to read anything, to find that 77% of all the money of the contracts that were tainted, it all happened at Transnet?
Evening, Vuyo. As you say, most of us who are engaging in the report are still trying to work our way through all of the facts. Yeah. But I think particularly when it regards the amount of money that is implicated in the case of Transnet, that is actually not a surprise to many of us who've been following the commission. Our colleagues from Shadow World Investigations, and particularly Paul Holden, quite late in the commission's life, took the commission and the public through the money flows linked to state capture, particularly the big projects, the big extractive corruption that occurred in places like Transnet and Eskom. And so we knew that the figures related to the amount of money that was tainted by corruption at Transnet was massive. Now, you've said the 72% of state capture, which is staggering in and of itself. But to put that into also rand terms, we're talking about over 40 billion rand in procurement from Transnet that is tainted by corruption. And a huge proportion of that, as you've said or intimated in the introduction, went to kickbacks to the Gupta family, to Gupta-related entities in a complex web of companies around the world in different places, facilitated by global banks. And so I think what's so important about this part of the report is that Transnet gives us a window into how the system of state capture worked, not only in terms of the extraction through the capture of state-owned entity boards and then corrupting procurement, but also then about how that money was laundered and used, how it was washed through different front companies set up by people like Salim Essa, so that the Gupta family could ultimately benefit from that money in places around the world.
Now, the primary architects, the report says, or enablers and implementers, were former CEO Brian Molefe, former CFO Anod Singh, former Transnet Freight Rail CEO Siabonga Agama. That too, I would imagine, comes as no surprise.
No, and this is much the same as was the case in the first report of the Zondo Commission, is that there is not a huge amount of material that we don't know. And when I say we, I mean the members of the public. And this is not representative of a failing of the commission at all. Rather, it's indicative of the fact that investigative journalists and whistleblowers in South Africa have been for many years documenting for us in the public interest what happened at these entities. And so we know the role and the names of people like Brian Molefe and Anoj Singh and the roles that they played in not just at Transnet, but their names will surely come up again in the role they played at Eskom. And that will no doubt be discussed in the final report. Again, though, I think what the power of the commission does is that instead of different pieces of reporting in different places, the commission has now sat for 4 years. It has heard all the evidence there is with regards to these individuals. It has offered all of them an opportunity to respond, and it has tested the evidence through rigorous questioning. And so I think what the power of the commission is that now, after all of that, we have an absolutely unambiguous and unequivocal answer on what the role of these individuals were. And of course, when we talk about next steps, this really then raises the fundamental question that everyone's asking is then now will the MPA be acting on some of these bigger cases? Because if these people were indeed, as the commission finds, the architects of the extraction of billions of rand in public money, they have to be held accountable. It has done untold damage to the South African country, to the economy. It has literally stolen money away from South Africans. And so the next step has to be genuine accountability. Once again, the commission is unambiguous that investigation and prosecution should follow. And so almost inevitably now all of our eyes pivot to the prosecuting authority, to the Hawks, to say, really now it is your move. There's no room for maneuver anymore. You have to act on these individuals.
I mean, before we then get to those next steps, Michael, I was looking at some of the recommendations. For example, one here says it is recommended that the law enforcement agencies conduct such further investigations as may be necessary with a view to the possible prosecution of Mr. Brian Molefe, Mr. Singh, Mr. Gigaba, Mr. Gama, Mr. Peter, and Mr. Gianni on charges of corruption as contemplated in Chapter 2 of the PRECA on racketeering charges in terms of Chapter 2 of POCA in relation to cash payments allegedly received by them during visits to the Gupta compound in Saxon World in the period 2010 to 2018.
Absolutely. And, we've heard, I think the public was kind of the things that stick in the memory are the stories of Mr. Molefe, allegedly traveling around with a backpack full of cash and the amount of money that was changing hands. One of the things that the commission points out in the first report, which I think is slightly disturbing, is that PRECA, which is the Prevention and Combating of Corrupt Activities Act, very clearly criminalizes any bribe giving, bribe taking, any exchange of money or other gratuity in exchange for a favor, for example, manipulating public procurement. And that's why the commission has identified that act as being a crucial point for prosecution for those individuals. But as the commission pointed out in the first report, the National Prosecuting Authority has only ever prosecuted one case in terms of PRECA since the legislation came into existence. And so this is really going to be, it's going to be an important test because those individuals will face surely a recommendation for prosecution as it relates to this instance of potentially accepting money as it relates to Transnet. But as I've mentioned earlier, I think that similar cases will come up again as it relates to Eskom and other state-owned entities. And so having it laid out in this way by the commission, I think, as I've said, is powerful, and it leaves, there's no ambiguity about what the next step has to be from the prosecuting authority.
Mm-hmm. I'm looking at another recommendation. Steps should be taken by Transnet now in terms of Section 77 of the Companies Act to recover from those members of the board who supported the unjustifiable settlement agreement between Transnet and Mr. Gama concluded on 23 February 2011. 2011, the amount of approximately 17 million paid and for the benefit of Mr. Gama pursuant to the agreement. In other words, there should be consequences for those people who didn't exercise their fiduciary duties.
Absolutely. I think this is very encouraging to see from the Commission that there's a recommendation in many places to pursue the recoup of funds. I think that's really important. Accountability is one thing in terms of facing, potential jail time due to a criminal offense or fines, but it's also crucial in all of these instances, particularly for the state-owned enterprises, which are still relying on state bailouts and government support, which of course costs the public money, that they are really actively pursuing the recuperation of those funds. This was something in the media, I think, again, yesterday, and no doubt will come up again. The issue, for example, of Brian Molefe's Eskom pension, which, according to the courts, was unlawfully granted. And he has been ordered to pay that back. And I think my understanding to date is that that hasn't happened. And so there's going to be many of these cases, as you say, where they've violated a fiduciary duty, where board members have approved unlawful payments or themselves received unlawful payments. And it's not only about prosecution, as you say, but it's about recouping those funds for the entity themselves. And that doesn't just rely on the state authorities, as you've pointed out, is up to the current boards of places like Transnet and Eskom to actively do those things. In the case of Transnet, I think we've seen some encouraging signs of their willingness to try and tackle these issues of state capture from their past. But they have a huge amount of work to do to go through the unlawful contracts and the conduct of ex-board members and pursue these kinds of actions against them.
Now, here's some, which then brings me to this, Michael. As you have just said, consequences for the people who were enablers and, implementers, and who too, the suggestion is benefited handsomely. Of course, there's going to have denied this at the commission, but fingers are pointing at them. And as you have just underscored, consequences for those people who sat on boards but didn't do the right things. But this morning in Parliament, the presidency made a presentation which was disturbing in many ways, in that one couldn't help but reach the conclusion that the investigations, subsequently prosecution, disciplinary hearings that some people who are still within, state departments and state-owned enterprises is actually not going smoothly. There seem to be huge problems then, which begs the question, with our hopes having been raised that these processes, the state capture inquiry, but also numerous other court cases that have the stuff that these processes have laid bare has raised hopes among South Africans that there's going to be consequences. But if the report that the presidency tabled before SCOPA this morning is anything to go by, we're going to wait a very, very long time before that even begins to happen.
I agree with you, Vuyo. It's going to be a long and difficult road. I think that, if there's anything that the reports of the commissions remind us, and when we go back to read it, is that it reminds us about how deep-seated these systems were and how entrenched they became and just how far these networks entrenched themselves across the state and across these entities. And so we have the commission saying in this case that we had ministers like Lynn Brown and Malusi Gigaba who exerted their power deliberately, it would appear, to put people into positions deliberately to extract cash for the benefit of Gupta-related companies. And I think once that happens over a certain number of years, you do have many institutions that become, that there's an entrenched problem there, right? And so it's not just a matter of removing one person or appointing one new CEO or head of a unit and suddenly things are going to turn around. I think within the entities themselves, it's going to be an incredibly long and painful process to remove many of the people that need to be removed. So that's on the one side, I think. I think on the other hand, just in terms of you referencing the presidency's point, and there's been a lot of discussion recently that's come up about, I think, the presidency's response and the party's response, is that as long as the president continues to insist that this was the problem of a few rogue elements and that it was not a systemic issue, for example, within the ANC, and this kind of repeated insistence that this is not a system problem, it's an individual problem, we're not going to make any progress. If there's anything that state capture showed us, is that this was a system of extraction that relied upon political party, private companies, private networks and families to capture the state in order to extract private benefit. And so a bit of honesty about what the problem was, would go a long way. And then the final point I think that you're referencing, which is so important, and that's something that the Commission in the reports hasn't got to yet, is that just like there was capture of state-owned enterprises, there was also manipulation and attempted capture of our law enforcement agencies. That was certainly taking place at places like the Hawks and the MPA.
In fact, Michael, the report the presidency tabled before Parliament today speaks to the serious capacity constraints and financial constraints that the SIU, for example, which has done some selling work when it comes to these the PPE corruption, and you wonder, then going forward, are institutions like those which aren't succeeding, not for lack of trying, but because they are seriously constrained. They have been hollowed out, but also they have serious financial constraints. Now, if they can't make, or we're not making as much progress with regard to PPEs, can you imagine how difficult and complex, it is going to be for them with such capacity and financial constraints to be dealing with these, billions that you're talking about with regard to Transnet alone?
And that's absolutely true. I think that particularly when it comes to the big state capture cases, it's going to have been incredibly difficult for very stretched and, as you say, hollowed out, I think that's the perfect phrase, state institutions to deal with that. I think that there's two things that I'd want to flag in response. The first is that, as civil society has pointed out, the decision by the government to reduce funding and not provide the funding to entities like the SIU and the MPA in the recent budget is incredibly short-sighted. There may be fiscal constraints, but the amount of money that we're talking about in terms of recovery and the benefit of accountability means that those entities should be receiving more funds from the budget. I think that is absolutely unambiguous. But the other thing I would say, Vuyo, and this is important to point out, is that the problems that we saw at Transnet and Eskom, there are very complex cases related to those, but there are also a lot of simpler cases that the MPA should be pursuing, and that honestly a lack of resources is no longer an excuse. Simple violations of the Public Finance Management Act, instances of failures to report corruption, those kind of things do not take years and complex investigations to uncover. And so I think the MPA and other law enforcement need to be smart about doing smaller strategic cases, what we would call the low-hanging fruit, and get momentum, start to build the trust of the public, show a track record, and that's one of the ways it can move forward while it tries to overcome those admittedly very deep-seated issues about resources and those other constraints.
Michael, let me thank you very much for your time and your insights this evening. He's the head of investigations at Open Secrets. Now, today she completes 2 years as the Deputy Public Protector, but what does Advocate Koleka Gcaleka have to show for her tenure? That's our conversation on the other side of this. Welcome back. Well, 2 years ago today, Advocate Koleka Galega joined the Office of the Public Protector as the Deputy Public Protector. 2 years on, how has it been? She joins us now to take us through it all. Good evening. Thanks very much for your time this evening, Koleka.
Good evening, Vuya, and good evening to the SABC Watchdog viewers. Thank you for having me back on your show.
I remember, literally hours, after you had arrived at the office. I was outside. I parked there for a good few hours, waiting for you to come out and say how you have been received. You insisted you were well received. Has it been like that?
Most definitely have been well received at the institution of the Public Protector.
It's been like that throughout. It's been great. It's been fun. You haven't had problems.
A journey of being a Deputy Public Protector has been fulfilling. It has been humbling. It has had its challenges, but challenges that as an institution been able to work around. But challenges really have been work-related. The work that we face together as an institution. I've not had any personal challenges with the institution.
Let's talk about how fulfilling it has been. What have you been able to do? What opportunities have you had which perhaps you didn't have or didn't have much of before you joined the office?
I've been able to serve at a front line, even though the Office of the Public Protector is supposed to be an office which takes complaints at last resorts. But because of the governance challenges that the country faces itself, as the Office of the Public Protector, we find ourselves being at the front line. Now, if you recall what I said to you, that I would actually be internally looking at the institution and see how I can assist the Public Protector as is prescribed in the Public Protector Act. And indeed, I've been able to do that. I've been able to do that within the institution, but within the work of the institution, within the institution, assisting to strengthen the capability of the institution itself, and externally ensuring that we're able to deliver on our developmental mandate as the Office of the Public Protector. As you are well aware, we've been running with a lot of impactful systemic investigations, such as the hospitals, which actually looked into the state of the healthcare system in our country, which we concluded during the COVID outbreak, and we've been able to start several other systemic investigations, such as the investigation that's looking into the higher education sector. But also, I've had an opportune time to act as a public protector for over 2.5 months, where I've been able to take decisions, as the acting public protector, and sign off on some reports, which included some of the procurement irregularities that happened during the pandemic in the Eastern Cape, some of the systemic matter into e-government in Gauteng, together with CETA, but also on other executive members' Ethics Act matters. So I've really been able to have an all-round of the institution, which for me has been quite fulfilling, and I've been able to make quite a meaningful contribution.
Now, apart from those, or outside of those instances where you've had to act for good 2.5 months as a public protector, and having to perhaps lead during when you guys were focusing on certain projects like the Eastern Cape that you've just mentioned. Outside of that, how exactly does it work? Does Advocate Mkhwebane allocate you specific responsibilities, or do you work on everything together, jointly? How exactly do you work?
I've got delegated responsibilities from the public protector, and mine currently is the bulk of the institution, which is the AJSD, Administrative Justice and Service Delivery Matters, which is about almost 93% of the matters that we have in the institution, and the bulk of the issues which are affecting the people of South Africa. But I also have delegated to me customer services and stakeholder relations, which is very critical for the Office of the Public Protector, because we need to ensure that we establish a good rapport and good relations with our stakeholders, particularly the state institutions whom we investigate and whom we wish to see that there is a redress in governance reforms and other governance issues that we look into as an institution, but also overall administrative matters. I make recommendations to the public protector in respect of those. And the good governance and integrity matters, there are instances where the public protector asks for my contribution in the matters that she is doing. And that's, of course, the bulk of the matters that she is dealing with. But she does time in and time out involve me in those matters. But even if I do not recommend in those matters, I, however, sit in the full bench, which was re-established during my acting tenure, which is basically a think tank of the public protector, inclusive of executive managers and other leadership of the public protector, wherein we look into the matters that the public protector is going to release. But however, the final decision is that of the public protector, even in those matters which are delegated to me.
And then if that's the bulk of the work that you then take, it then leaves her with what? In other words, what then does she focus on?
The public protector focuses on the good governance and integrity matters, which I have said are not delegated to me. And she also focuses on oversight over the administration, but which I also have a contribution in, because I make recommendations to her on those matters.
And when you said humbling, in other words, apart from fulfilling, it's also been a humbling experience over the past 2 years. What exactly did you mean?
Basically, is to have insight into the work that the investigators and the support staff in the Office of the Public Protector are doing, the magnitude, the complexity, but also their dedication into this work. Despite all the other media views about the Office of the Public Protector, the staff of the Public Protector remains committed to serving the people of South Africa to an extent that we work extensive hours into the night, because we want to make sure that the people of South Africa receive the services that they're supposed to receive. Social justice is done, justice is done. But also the conditions, the socio-economic conditions that the people of South Africa continue to live under. We are also currently busy with a systemic investigation into the state of service delivery in the Eastern Cape that has given me quite insight on how far our country has come in respect of delivering services to the poorest of the poor people. The healthcare system investigation, which gives me sufficient and insight into the healthcare system beyond what I read on paper, and me having been privileged to have access to a private hospital, but having been there on the ground and realize what the people and the majority of the people of our country are still going through in our democracy, considering that the Office of the Public Protector is entrusted with strengthening democracy. So it's really been humbling for me to have a real life experience of people still getting water in dirty rivers, people still not having bridges to cross over. And those are the real life issues that the majority of the South Africans are going through.
Yeah, I listened to I was sitting through the briefing yesterday, talk about people, these are individual people who are, 17 years down the line, didn't have the houses that they were promised, and hopefully within 90 days or thereabouts, they will get their houses and so on, courtesy of or thanks to the public protector's rulings. But you said something that you mentioned almost in passing, but I know it's not in passing, where you said despite what has been said or the things that get said about the office of the public protector. What are those things that have been said about the public protector which didn't sit well with you, or which are simply not true from where you sit?
For me, Vuyo, is the issues of the incompetence of the office, even though some might want to attribute it to an individual, but the reality is that there is a team that is working on these particular cases. There is a team which is not as strengthened as it should be, in line with what is required from them, by the Constitution, but who are making do of what they have. They are stretching themselves to fit the resource that is expected of them, and yet the kind of criticisms that they receive is not taking into consideration the circumstances under which they work.
And he also mentioned challenges. What have been the challenges of your journey over the past 2 years?
It's working under strained resources. The Office of the Public Protector is highly under-resourced. It is not just an ordinary office of an ombud that you would find anywhere else, but through the developed jurisprudence, through the case law, our mandate has been extended. And it has been extended to an extent that we are required to go beyond social justice, which is the bare minimum of an office of an ombudsman. We need to be legal, highly legal as an office. Now, when the office was established, that was not intention of the establishment of the office. Now, you find that there are investigators who have not practiced in court before, who do not know how to interpret statutes, court judgments, etc. And that is a skill that, with the resources that we are having, we are unable to develop. However, we've had to come up with other means to look at how do we develop that skill, because right now we require a diverse and an agile Office of the Public Protector which fits the environment within which we function. That has been the major challenge for me. For instance, the Office of the Public Protector is not properly resourced in terms of research and learning and development as an office, which is a resource that we need to look in externally right now. We are engaging with the Office of the Department of Justice. We are engaging with other stakeholders, even externally, for us to be able to access resources so that we can capacitate our investigators and those who are involved in the food chain of our cases. So for me, really, that has been the major challenges that I have encountered. But also because knowledge of the office is so not as much capacitated as it should be, it also lessens the foundation of the office, because what is important, especially in an institution like ours, is for it to have a strong foundation so that it becomes a resilient institution. Even whether whomever is the public protector, whatever criticism comes their way, they are able to resist that and they are able to withstand that. But as things stand, it's a huge challenge for us, because issues of learning and development is issues where we are not there where we are supposed to be.
And how would you describe your relationship with Advocate Mkhwebane?
We've got a good collegial relationship.
And that's about it?
Yes.
Thank you.
If you would want me to expand. We've got a relationship where we debate on issues that are happening in the office. We've got a relationship where she actually takes some of the issues that I raised with her. When I arrived, she actually gave me an opportunity to do a situational analysis, which I did, and I made recommendations to her on the systemic issues within our institution and governance issues within our institution that we need to strengthen in order to have a public protector's office that is not only envisaged for today, but envisaged for tomorrow, the wellness of our employees, issues of working around the integrity and the ethics of the office, working around strengthening the policies of the office, our investigation techniques, so that we become an investigating authority that can really be trusted by the people, and our integrity, by the way, relies on that. And those are really recommendations that the public protector welcomed from me, and the implementation thereof progressed, and those are some of the issues that we are, of course.
Okay, up at the very last minute, that line giving us problems there. Special thanks to the Deputy Public Protector, Advocate Koleka Galega, who, as of yesterday, I should say, has completed 2 years in that office, reflecting there on her tenure. Well, Judge Mbuyiseli Madlanga today appeared before the JSE. She was the first shortlisted candidate to do so. She was quizzed on many things throughout the day. Listen to him talking about the criticisms that have been leveled at South Africa's judges. Several commissioners asking him what he thought of what has been said, especially over the past a few weeks, about judges in our country. Here's part of his answer.
What would you do as Chief Justice to ensure that the idea of equality is not just lip service and it's not just a numbers game? It's about qualitative change and infusing certain ideas within, or rather, and killing certain ideas that might be pervasive within the profession in particular, along the lines of, in other words, what would we gain by having a feminist Chief Justice like you?
The practical difficulties are that it is more the profession itself that should fight those battles. It is my organization, I will still own it even though I'm no longer in it, Advocates for Transformation, in which you are. These organizations like Babasa, it is even in the attorney's profession like BLA, NADEL, that need to fight those battles. I know that a retort might be, but we have been fighting them, but we are still where we are. But that's a fight that should never ever end. If anything, it should be intensified. The problem is always briefing patterns. I touched on it in the context of my not just myself, of course, but I use myself as an example. The problem is that it's a perennial problem, it's a systemic problem. But as a Chief Justice, what can you do? Maybe more engagement with the profession itself, and maybe selling the ideas of getting the profession at all levels to do some of the things, for example, that I, as an advocate at a transformative level, in practical terms, was able to do. So much that Advocate Nsaluba SC, in a letter of motivation at the nomination stage before the president, wrote this about me. He said, I do not only speak about transformation at public platforms or on podiums. And he says, I, and I quote, live, L-I-V-E, transformation, close quote.
Advocate Madlanga on, of course, transformation. But what does he think of the media and the judiciary's relationship with the Fourth Estate?
The criticism should never go to a level at which it will bring the courts to a state where they no longer enjoy the respect that they should enjoy from the general populace. Because once that stage is reached, then one may just as well say that the idea of the rule of law in South Africa has gone out through the window. So the judiciary should continue to enjoy the legitimacy and the confidence that it should have in order for the rule of law to continue functioning properly. So as much as I accept that there should be criticism, it should be criticism, one, that is fact-based, and two, it should not be criticism that is for no other reason, one, not being fact-based and calculated to bring the entire edifice of the judiciary into disrepute.
Well, that was day one of the JSE interviews of the 4 shortlisted candidates for the position of Chief Justice. Tomorrow, it's going to be the President of the Supreme Court of Appeal, Mandisa Maya. The SABC will, of course, is bringing you those interviews live here on the SABC News Channel 404. But from us, the team, the Watchdog team, it's a good night till we meet again tomorrow evening at 8 o'clock. Good evening.